Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Umber Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 and one for 30, and it's your job to draw the image that you see. Lizet will be joining us today. She'll be doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow her advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Once it's finished, don't forget to post your photographs on Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to another Raw Umber portrait video. This week I want to recap measuring, proportions and shadow shapes. So I will be using a compressed charcoal here that you can find in the materials list. Make sure it's got a nice sharp point. And you can use a bit of sandpaper for this to sharpen it quickly. And of course I'll also be using a putty rubber, which is great because it's very moldable. So that means that I can make it into fine points for fine erasing or a wedge shape if I want to erase large areas. Finally, for blending, I'm using a Daler & Rowney flat synthetic brush, but you can also use your finger, a stump or even a piece of tissue. Now, in order to simplify a head, it's useful to think of it as a big box. So, if you look at her top of her head versus the bottom of her head, we can just draw those in on the paper wherever we want them to be. Make sure to keep your arm outstretched and not draw from the wrist, but draw from the shoulder instead. And what we're doing today is using comparative measurements, which means that we place the portrait on the actual paper and then we can compare how things relate to each other. So first let's put the rest of the box in. So I'm just putting in the front plane and the back plane. And you know that this box is straight because if you look at the chin to her forehead, if you lay your pencil across that, that's pretty much vertical. So that's the front plane of the face. And in portraiture, it's all about simplifying what we see. So a very useful standardized measurement is the rule of 3/3. If we take that vertical front plane of the face and you divide that into 3 equal parts, usually the nose, the bottom of the nose, the top of the brows, the bottom of the chin and the top of the forehead will line up with those 3/3. Of course, every individual is different, but these measurements are a good starting point, and then you can see, oh, maybe this person has a smaller forehead or a longer nose or something like that. Another useful measurement is the midpoint. So if you take the whole skull from top to bottom and divide that into 2 halves, you can see this on the picture, but also we can then draw that on the drawing. You can see that is roughly where the eyes start. Now you can imagine that line from the brow extending backwards to the middle of the head and that horizontal line of the bottom of the nose extending. And you can see that the ear is wedged in between those 2 lines. And if I want to find out where the ear is in terms of vertical lines, what I do is I find the midpoint of my box by drawing a cross. And the ear will be located behind that midpoint of that cross. Note that the ear is not always vertical, it's angled just a little bit backwards. And this midpoint is also where the jawline starts. So just before the lobe of the ear, you can see the jawline dropping pretty much vertically and then slowly bending towards the chin. A final measurement is that midpoint is also the back of the skull. So these are the main measurements of the head that I always use for whatever portrait I am going to draw. Of course, if you're having any issues with this, feel free to pause the video and ask me anything you like. But in the meantime, I'm going to start breaking this down further. Starting with the outline, we can see that the brow goes inwards towards the bridge of the nose. And of course the nose is a wedge shape coming out of that general plane of the face. Note that I am using light lines here, and all of my lines are pretty straight, and this is because it's a lot easier to measure using straight lines and to also change my straight lines. So I'm really looking at this as a construction. And this stage is called the block-in, and you can see why, because they're big blocks that I'm slowly constructing into a skull. So let's use these same straight lines to figure out what the lips are doing. So looking at the bottom of the nose, the bottom of the chin, if I divide that into 3/3 again on the picture, you can see that the middle of the lips is 1/3 down and the start of the chin is that 1/3 up. So from there we can then use the straight lines and then carve out the humps and bumps. And these blocks are also useful for shadow shapes. So shadow shapes are really useful to draw attention to the form moving and give an illusion of depth. And when drawing a shadow shape, think about squares and triangles. So for instance, on the tip of her nose we can see a triangle of light. So go ahead and just draw that in and keep your lines nice and straight. And once you have that triangle in, you could then look at the square shape just above it. So the square shadow shape that goes from that top of the light triangle to the middle of her eye. And then I like to just glaze that in with a light touch. And then once I have that, I work my way down the same manner. So I look at vertical alignments and horizontal alignments. And this is just really forgetting about what you know and just drawing triangles and squares. And this can feel very counterintuitive because ultimately what you want to draw is a portrait. So eyes and lids and eyebrows and lips. But ultimately what you want to do is just continue drawing these shapes and a portrait will start to appear. When drawing these shapes, it's useful to think of angles. So imagine you've got a clock or a sphere. And you can see that we've got 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. But of course, there's also 3, 4, 5 o'clock. So for instance, for the angle, the side of the nose to the mouth, we can see that's pretty much 4 o'clock. So I'm now going to continue working my way down and just squinting and looking at the dark shape versus the light shape and just drawing these in very geometrically. A little note about when you're shading in, it's best to make parallel lines with a very light touch. And try to lift your pencil or your charcoal after every stroke. This just after a little bit of practice you'll get quicker and quicker at this and you'll get a nice even tone. Okay, so now we have everything in, and even though I've only been drawing triangles and squares, you can see that a portrait has started to appear. So we're going to do this again in the 20-minute pose. So for the 20-minute pose, we've got a very similar pose, but she is just turning a little bit further towards us. So let's have a look at how that works. So let's start with drawing the box anywhere you'd like on the paper here. And of course, don't forget that midpoint, which is the anchor for the eyes. And let's divide this into 3 thirds again for the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose, bottom of the nose to top of the brow, and top of the brow to top of the head. Now for this pose I want to do something a little bit challenging. So we're going to go straight into shadow shapes and not using a single line. So for the forehead, for instance, look at the angle of the outline there. You can see it's pointing to about 1 o'clock. And if you then look at that shadow, you can see it as a rectangular box following along that same angle. So I'm just going to shade that in without using an outline. And once you see that angle, you can also see, of course, the angle of her hair and the angle of the brow to the nose. And the goal here is to not have lots of little shadow shapes that are floating in the face, but instead connect them all up into one big long chain. So for instance, the bottom of her nose, of course, her nostril is separate from the rest of her shadow shape on her nose, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just connect these shadow shapes together. And later what I can do is then carve that back out with my rubber. And of course from there, we can connect that with the shadow shape going from the bottom of her nose to the bottom of her chin. And really note that I'm not looking for small changes here in her lips and the curve of her chin. I'm just looking for the big measurements here, and then later I'm going to be more precise. For instance, on her eye socket, you can just imagine it's a square shape with a little triangle hanging underneath it. And simplifying shadows like this can be really, really useful because it gives you the opportunity to just find things and slowly get to a place where everything looks right, rather than having to do it all perfectly from the start. Of course, for the mouth, like we're saying, you can divide that up into 3 thirds again, and that will be the start of the lip and the start of the chin. And I'm just going to indicate that with a little bit of shadow. And this way of drawing can be very, very difficult to get to grips with first because our brains work on touch. So naturally we want to put an outline around everything. But when you get to grips with these shadow shapes versus light shapes, you can really start drawing anything you like, because ultimately, visually, everything is made up out of these light and these dark shapes. Okay, so following horizontally along that eye line, we know that is the back of the head, and we also know that that midpoint is where the jawline will start, which is also the starting point of the ear. And like I was saying in the 10-minute pose, the ear always sits above the bottom of the nose and below the brow. And feel free to do what I'm doing now, which is basically shade everything in and then carve the ear out with the rubber. And that can sometimes be easier than having to get the little shapes in straight away. Now remember what I was saying about those angles? in a 10-minute pose, you can also imagine a line going through various points to make it easier to see where something's leading. A very obvious example of that is the plumb line that many people use, but you can also use an angled line for this. So for instance, if I look at the shadow shape and I connect it up with the side of her nostril, I can connect that up with the side of her mouth, and that goes all the way in her neck. And so these big straight lines can be really, really useful to help you with the drawing and the big proportions. Now, like I was saying, in the 10-minute pose, it's useful to try and get a light touch and to make sure that you've really filled in your shadows quite evenly. But at this stage, it's also maybe a good idea to just go in with a little brush or maybe tissue or a stump and just flatten the shadows a little bit. And this has got a few functions, and one of them is that when you flatten the shadows, your eye gets freed up, meaning that all the texture in the shadows gets erased, and therefore your eye can really see what's going on a lot better and is not distracted by all the textures. So this is what gives you what you call a fresh eye, meaning that your eye gets a new look on the drawing, and therefore it's easier to see what's actually going on because our eyes get used to what we're drawing as we spend a bit of time on it. And the second reason why this flattening is also useful is because our eyes naturally look at where we find the most texture. And because without flattening, that is in the shadows, our eye naturally gets led into the shadows, but that's not really where we want the viewer to look. So that's why I like to flatten a shadow and keep it relatively transparent, so visually it also recedes. Now let's use that fresh eye and look at the drawing and see if there's anything off and start adding smaller shapes on top. And adding these smaller shapes is not going to be any different than what we did earlier. So still keeping the line straight and still just looking at little triangles and squares without looking at what the thing actually is. And this way of drawing is essentially pioneered by the Impressionists. So they found out that all light and color really is just light falling on your retina. And our brain then puzzles that together into a face. And this is also the reason why you can see faces in the clouds and faces in the moon. And this is just because our brain is geared to see faces in these shapes. And this is called pareidolia. You don't actually need to know this, but I just thought it was a fun fact. And it's just a very normal human tendency. And we can use that in our drawing. So instead of drawing the eyes out, we just use little shapes and the viewer will start filling it in all by themselves. Now going back to the drawing, if you want to draw a curve with straight lines, all you have to do is make the straight lines have smaller and smaller increments. So looking at the forehead here, for instance, if you look at that, you can really see it's actually made up of lots of straight lines. So when I put those in, you can see a curve naturally forming. And this way of creating a curve using lots of straight angle breaks can be a lot stronger and a lot more structured than just a freehand curve. So I'm now going to make my way down towards the lower half of the face, and again only working on the outside of the shadow shapes, making them more precise and using straight lines. And if you find that you've overdone the shadow a little bit, this is where the putty rubber is really useful, because you can knead it into such small shapes. You can use that to carve out the negative shape, meaning the opposite shape to the shadow. So I'm using it here for the bottom and the top lip. If you don't have a putty rubber, just have a normal white rubber, what you can do is take a knife and slice it into a wedge shape, and this makes it a lot more precise and easy to carve in. So you can see at this point that without drawing anything in the shadows or in the light, a face has started to form. And this way of working can also apply to stuff like texture. For instance, if I want to draw a hair, without drawing every individual hair, all I need to do is look at the texture of the outline of the shadow. So you can see that's nice and humpy and bumpy. So all I need to do is draw some humps and bumps on the texture, and then blend it with the rest of the shadow, and you can see how hair starts to form. And again, this is just without drawing anything in the shadows, but just by looking at the outside of the shadow shape. I also like to use my brush or your stump or tissue if you're using that, just to blend some of the shadows into the light a bit more softly, but we'll get more into that in the 30-minute pose. In the meantime, if I'm going a bit too quick for you, or you have any questions, feel free to pause the video and ask me anything you like in the comments. Some people also find it useful to just watch the very first time they watch this and then draw afterwards. Okay, so that's the end of the 20-minute pose. Okay, so for the 30-minute pose, we're going to start exactly the same way. So just placing her on the paper where you want her. And for drawings or portraits that are looking straight at me, I like to draw a vertical center line. So that's a line going from the middle of the forehead, from the middle of the nose to the middle of the chin. And then on top of that center line, I can divide the face into 2 halves and of course the 3/3. Now you can still think of the head as a box in a head that's going straight at you, but the main thing to remember is that the width is 2/3 of the length here. And with comparative measurement, I first measure the photo and just for instance compare the bottom of her chin to the bottom of her nose, and then the bottom of her nose to her cheekbone, and that is exactly the same length and it's both 1/3. Now I'm going to draw in her ears. And I see them horizontally at around the same area as the corners of her eyes, so which is the midpoint of the pose. And I see them going just below that bottom of the nose. And again, these are all the lines that we're going to put on, so I'm going to jump straight into shadow shapes again. And I'm going to start with my big shadow shape on the side of her head first and just looking at how many times it fits in the total width of the pose. And I see that about halfway the middle of her face. So it fits in 4 times the total width of her face. So that's where I'm going to place that big shadow shape. And then we can start breaking that down further. And now we've got her hair and the shadow shape in. We can start looking at the next biggest shape, and in this case I see that is the side of her nose, and that's a big triangle. And because we know where the brows should roughly be and we know where the bottom of the nose should roughly be, we can just sketch in that big triangle from there. Try to simplify this triangle into just 2 lines for now, and then later we're going to break it down further. For the brows, I can just use a dark shadow shape, and if you squint you can see this really well. It connects up with that shadow shape of the nose. For the neck, again, if you see from the chin, it's just a triangle again. So you can just put that in. And to make seeing these shadow shapes easier, I tend to squint at my drawing a lot, and this just simplifies all the details in the shadow and in the light and allows me to just concentrate on the division between them. Another thing you can do is use a mirror. When you look upside down into the picture, your brain doesn't associate all those shapes with a portrait anymore, and therefore it's easy to just see the squares and the triangles and all the other shapes. So we're just trying to trick our brain into not seeing a portrait, but just shapes. For the mouth, again, we can divide the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into 3/3. And I know in this case that the top lip is not exactly in shadow, But just for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna just make it in shadow, and later we can break that down further. Same thing for the bottom of the nose. We can see that that nostril is actually floating on its own, but just to make it easier on ourselves, just connect them up for now, and later we can carve out with the rubber. Now for the other eye, there's actually not much shadow in there, but if you squint at it, you can see that the base of the brow and the inner corner of the eye is a little bit darker, and it's again a sort of triangle shape. So I'm going to draw that in. And then I'm going to start flattening my shadows. So now we can start to see a vague idea of the portrait. So what I did in the last post and what I'll do again now is I'm going to just start refining it. So looking at all my shapes with a nice fresh eye, maybe use a mirror if you need to, and then looking at it and thinking, can I change the shape to be a bit more accurate? So instead of adding more information per se, we're just adjusting the information we have to make it a little bit more accurate and a bit more precise. And this is also a good time to start carving out the rubber. So for instance, the nostril can be carved out now. And you might wonder why I didn't just draw the nostril separate from the start. And the reason for this is twofold. On the one hand, if you draw lots of small separate shadow shapes, the drawing can start to feel a little bit bitty. And also the nose or the nostril or whatever you're drawing can start floating, because of course it's very natural to make very small mistakes, and these can even be a millimeter or so. But a portrait is very, very symmetrical. So it's always useful to relate the drawing to other places and to make sure that those big shadows are connected up, and that ensures the structure of the portrait. And the other reason for it is to do with breadth. And this is a concept in art, meaning that if you have broad light shapes and huge dark shapes, both of these get more emphasis. So if you have lots of little dark shapes and lots of little light shapes, neither of them feel very strong. But if you have one huge dark shape and one huge light shape, both of them start feeling like there's more contrast, and therefore it draws the eye in. And this method of drawing has been used by countless artists, from Rembrandt to Sargent. It's very applicable and easy to do in paint as well. So I think it's a very useful thing to get to grips with. So hopefully now you've got an idea of where everything is placed and you're pretty happy with how the portrait is looking at this stage. It should look a bit vague, but human. If you're not quite happy with it, feel free to pause the video. But in the meantime, I'm gonna start finishing this up. And one way to do this is to start putting accents along the outline of the shadow. So again, we're not working inside the light or inside the shadow, we're just working on the edges between the two. And feel free to use the point of the pencil here to look at any areas that are nice and clear and sharp. So for instance, I see in the inner corner of her eye, it's a very clear division between light and shadow. So I'm going to emphasize that. But for instance, on the other side, we see it's not that clear. So I'm going to blend that with my brush or the stump or the tissue. And when you're doing this, there are definitely some shadows to look out for. One of those is a cast shadow. So a cast shadow is a shadow that's being cast by another object. So in this case, a very obvious example is the nose. The nose is casting a shadow on the rest of her face. And with cast shadows, what you can usually see, it's darker and sharper at the start of the cast shadow and gets softer the further away it gets from the object. The polar opposite of this is a form shadow, and this is an area where a shadow is slowly turning away, and this is most of the side of her forehead and her face, and the rounder that object is, the softer it will turn away. Now let's have a look at her eye. So her eye is composed of various shadow shapes. For instance, the top lid is actually in darkness because, as you can imagine, it's casting a shadow downwards as it curves over the eyeball. The iris itself you can see as a dark shape, and the white of the eye is a little triangle of light. Make sure that these smaller shadow shapes are still connected to the big shadow shape that we've put down earlier, and to resist the temptation of going into the details too much. You can see just by drawing an iris in and a little bit of a top lid, there's already a lot of information we're conveying here. Feel free to carve in with the rubber and add smaller shapes, but keep all of your attention to the edge of the shadows and not on the inside of the shadows. The other eye is just a mirror image of the left eye. So I'm just going to take that as my guideline and then just copy what I did there. Just a top lid and an iris. The lower lid doesn't usually need a shadow shape because the lower lid is actually going up towards the light. So therefore will usually be a light shape rather than a dark shape. And now might be a good time to start softening some areas and think of how things are turning. So for instance, the top lip is of course slowly turning down, and therefore we can start softening that with the brush or the tissue or the stump. And the softer you can make these transitions, the more contrast there is between that and the harder accents that we've put in the eye and the bottom of the nose, and therefore the more contrast there is between them. In other words, if you can overstate the hard and the soft edges, the more like skin it will start to feel. Now we've spoken about these harder edges on places like a cast shadow, but of course there's also overlaps. So she is against a white background, so there's some clear overlap there. So that's a nice place to really work on that outside edge. And this can convey a lot of information as well. For instance, the hair is a bit fluffy, so feel free to soften that, whereas the skin is more clear, so you can have a nice sharp edge there. Of course, if something's not quite clear to you, feel free to ask me anything in the comments if you're watching this live. Now for the last minutes of the pose, I'm just going to continue to refine my drawing. And this is really all that finish really is. It's just looking at that shadow shape, looking at that light shape, and how do the two interact. And the more subtlety you can get into that, the more real your drawing will start to feel. And note as well, for instance, that the bottom right of her jawline actually has no line at all, and we never actually put that in. But you're not missing that, and this is because our brains again connect up the shapes. So our brains subconsciously are connecting up the side of our head with the bottom of the jawline, and therefore will understand that there is a jawline there. And often this can be a lot more exciting as a drawing than something that's completely drawn in and everything feels like it's spelled out. And I always think of it as telling a story. It's better to let the viewer guess a little bit and use their brain and try and fill in the dots rather than have everything spelled out. So that's the end of the 30-minute pose. I hope that this was insightful for you and that you feel like you've learned something about shadow shapes and measuring. We always love to see your work. So if you use Instagram, feel free to post your work using the hashtag #RawUmberLive. And hopefully I will see you in another video.
Thank you for taking part. I'd like to thank Lizet for joining us today as well. Don't forget to photograph your work, post them on Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 p.m. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.